Hi everybody, I'm here today with Dr. Mary Hughes. She's a senior lecturer of the Bachelor of Early Childhood Studies at Holmes Glen Institute here in Melbourne. I've had the pleasure of knowing Mary for several years now as a teaching colleague, part mentor and friend. Mary, thank you so much for joining us today. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to have some of your very precious time. You're an extremely busy person, so thank you for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Jo. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm sure we'll enjoy our conversation very much today.
We can usually find something to talk about.
We can.
Mary, I do have a series of questions for you, but if you don't mind, would you mind speaking a little bit to your current experience at Holmes Glen just at the moment? Before we started recording this conversation, you mentioned that just about all of your work's been off campus for several months now.
Mm. Yes, Jo. So with the COVID lockdown rules and regulations, we've been off campus since the middle of March. So we didn't even go back in that little break that we had. So all of our lectures are online. So it's a blend of online and self-study, more or less. So we've got lectures and the modules that are up on our Brightspace. And so we have some face-to-face sessions, but a lot of it is fairly independent work. And currently almost all of the students are out on prac. So we're doing weekly support meetings for them. And instead of assessors going out into the schools and into the preschools, we are doing it all over Zoom. So it's a new space and a very interesting space.
Yeah, I'd say so. So prior to COVID and moving in the direction of embracing more technology, certainly my time in Holmes Glen, back in those days, it was Moodle. And, I remember clearly that the idea and the prospects of how virtual learning would happen. It's interesting, as you say, now there's this blend and offering support to your students, many who are approaching their final pracs and ready to be pre-service teachers. That's correct, isn't it? Next year.
Graduate teachers next year.
I knew it sounded wrong. They're pre-service at the moment.
Yes.
What's in your experience with some of your students, how are they finding things, from your experience?
I've surveyed some of the, informally surveyed some of the students that I teach, and the clear message is that they miss very much not coming on campus. They miss their friends. They said to me, we even miss the coffee in the caf because, the coffee's dreadful, but we still miss it because it's what goes around the coffee. It's the friends, it's the break from lectures. There's a bit of a spread between those who are very comfortable with the technology and with the Zoom meetings and lectures and so on. And there are those who really miss it very much and who are much more comfortable with that person-to-person contact. So I don't think we'll ever really see, particularly in teaching, we'll never really see fully online becoming the way to go. Look, it's there for those who need it, particularly rural and remote teaching or pre-service teaching. But for those general people who like to come to uni and have classes, I don't think we'll ever see things going more than even half face-to-face.
It's so interesting how we're at this point because, years ago, it was the thought of everything's moving online and that's the way it will be. And then our collective hand has been forced, hasn't it, to it's happening. It's not being a build up. And I think I know myself, having graduated more than 20 years ago, you couldn't have imagined a world like it is now. And sometimes there's a temptation to look at the past and what was better. So I hope to think that there will be. It's nice to hear that these young pre-service teachers are kind of getting the sense of the world that we lived in when we were studying and training, but also the benefit, as you say, particularly for remote learners.
Yeah.
There's reaching areas that would have been very difficult to get to without
Yes.
online presence. It's one of those things where they say curse and a blessing, I suppose, but perhaps more blessing.
Yes. When I originally trained very, very long ago, and I needed to update and get the bachelor. So I did a diploma of teaching, which is not like the diplomas now. It was more of a uni course, but I had to do a bachelor, and I was up in northern Victoria, so fairly rural and remote, and I did 2 years by correspondence, it was called in those days. So everything, the modules were all mailed out to us, and when we had assignments due, we had to mail them at least by the Thursday evening so that they would hit Wagga Wagga, which was Charles Sturt University, of course. And so as long as the assignment was received up there by late Monday, which shows how good the post was in those days. And so
not necessarily Australia Post in 2020.
No. So look, that model of remote learning has been in, and this I'm talking about the middle 80s. It has been in now for a long time, but I think it suits certain contexts and not other contexts.
Yes, and I was just thinking when you mentioned your young adult students, obviously I'm still teaching preschoolers. It's really it's really revealing and intriguing to find out the experience of our younger students to young adults, and some mature age students as well, who are in the midst of changing career or upgrading, those sorts of things, upgrading their skills. Really interesting times to be in education.
It certainly is.
I've got other colleagues that I'm speaking to in Europe and the UK, and some in the US as well. It's interesting how this collective conversation about education is changing. The landscape is really changing. So the point of bringing people together in this way for me, Mary, is to hopefully shed some light and bring some lightness and some joy and some fun back into a very rewarding career, a very challenging career at times for different reasons. Mary and I spoke briefly before we started recording today, and thinking about the changes and looking to other careers to see what's the standard workplace versus the way that teaching and education is being perceived. In this way, we've got an opportunity to really take that spotlight, the global spotlight on education. For a while, I think, certainly in early childhood circles, we looked to Europe to see what they were doing, and maybe sometimes looking at ourselves and feeling, especially based on surveys and government feedback and assessing ourselves against, here's an opportunity for us to come together, which is quite exciting. Yes. And it's my personal mission to bring joy into teaching. In my own experience, it's something that as a pre-service teacher back at that time, so we're talking about the late 1990s, fun didn't seem to be featuring. It seemed to be quite serious, and everything had to be strict and predestined or predetermined. There was only one sort of road to take with education. But I specifically reached out to you, Mary. We have some of the most fascinating conversations, our own experiences plus our shared. I'd like to start my first question with you in asking you what brought you to teaching in the first place.
Okay, so I will be quite upfront and say that I did what was then HSC, but VCE back in the mid-70s. So I go back quite a while with my teaching experience. And I finished my VCE, as I say, in 1976, and I had actually majored in music studies. So part of performance and theory for Year 12 music then was that you did the entrance exam for what is now the Victorian College of the Arts, but was then part of the conservatorium. So I did piano. That has really held me in very good stead for my whole career, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But I did my VCE, and I came from a farming family, and again, rural northern Victoria, from Shepparton. And my father was a farmer, and his thought was that, you know, university was a bit of a waste of time. It's good for girls to get a job. And my mother was a teacher, and she had quite a different view of it. She had been down to Melbourne Uni to get her teaching qualification, and she felt that uni was the way to go. So there was this push and pull a little bit at home, in a not in a negative way, but you know, it was there. So when the exams were finished, my dad arranged for me to have a couple of interviews in Shepparton. I know one was with a family friend who had a law business, so he needed a legal secretary. And I went in and did the interview, and I came out and I thought, gee, this is really not where I want to be. I don't want to do this. And another one was with an insurance agent, and I thought, no, don't want to do this. So I went home and I said to mum and dad, look, you know, I don't think this is for me. I'd really like to be a teacher, and I'd like to go to uni. So mum said, well, you've applied for that scholarship to go to Ballarat, to the Teachers College there, and lo and behold, after must have been just after the last interview with, I think it was one of the General Motors places, Holden or something in Shepparton, the letter came through the mail to say that I'd received a scholarship to Ballarat Teachers College, and I needed to be there. I think it was about the first week in February. So I was very, very excited, and Dad was really happy and so proud on the day I graduated. So everything worked out well. And so really that's how I got into teaching. It was one of the very few choices that really, as girls in Year 12 in a country school in Shepparton, there was nursing, teaching, and you could do office work. And one of my best friend went off and did medicine at Melbourne Uni, and that was very, very rare. She was considered to be quite the scholar, and it was very unusual. So yeah, that's how I got into teaching.
You mentioned your mum, Mary, and
yep.
you mentioned the healthy debate. You know, it sounds like a very supportive environment. And bless your dad, your biggest supporter.
Yes.
And in the context of the time, of course, when you look back and think how much progression we've had.
Yes, we have.
It's with your mum as a teacher, you clearly saw something in her career, in her occupation that influenced you in some way, your mum's career choice?
Yes, it certainly did. And not only that, we'll talk a little bit later on about mentorship, but really, if it wasn't for mum in those early days of me teaching, because it was sink or swim at the school I was in, I really didn't get a lot of support there. And if it wasn't for mum, I would have left teaching, I think. I remember going home in tears at one stage because I worked away from Shepparton. I actually worked in Wodonga, so I'd drive home at weekends. And if it wasn't for mum, I probably would have quit. But mum was certainly a career teacher, and she graduated during the war years from Melbourne Uni in the 1940s. And so she took on teaching certainly as a career, and she didn't get married until she was well into her 30s. So she used to talk to me in later years about how tough it was. She worked her way up the ladder, and at that time, a lot of the male teachers a couple of them walked out at one stage when she got a promotion, and they had to work under a woman. So she was deputy headmistress at quite a big school, and two of the men walked out and said, we're not coming back until she's replaced. and there was a bit of a, I suppose you'd now call it a bit of a hearing, and the principal, who was very strong and really aligned himself with Mum and her beliefs, and he said, well, okay, walk. And if you come back here, you will have to work under Eileen. And at the end of the day, they did, fairly reluctantly, and she said it was tough, but she said I treated them just like any other person, with respect and so on, and we all had a good working relationship. She said I also supervised some men in those days who I worked really well with. So she said it was tough. When she was having me, when she got married, that's right, she had to resign, of course, and because married women couldn't work as teachers. This was in the 50s. And when she was having me, so she went back temporarily on reduced pay, and because she was a married woman. And when she was having me, she really had to resign, and she stayed home for the first 8 years of my life. And when I was about 8, she returned back to school. So yes, Mum did have a terrific influence on me.
She sure did. I sincerely, I want to say thank you to every woman that's contributed to allowing us to have things that we sometimes take for granted.
Absolutely.
In 2020. So thank you, Eileen.
Yes.
What a remarkable lady.
Yes, yes. And she also mentioned, after the war, a lot of the men came home from the war and didn't have jobs or careers at hand. And so they popped them through this really brief teacher training, and they came into the schools, and some of the women were expected then to move back into the homes. And she said a lot of them just dug their heels in and said, no, we're not doing that. So there was a lot of this gender tension going on in those probably early 50s years within teaching. We often don't know about.
No, I think I'm going to have to interview you again just on that topic. Yeah. Wow. I almost don't want to move on to my next question. Change the course of the
we must.
However, I will. Mary, you've outlined some of the things that we take for granted now. I mean, being given a position at university and facing the challenge, well, to use a different word, facing the situation where your dad had tried to set you up in a career, and respectfully you took that step, and yes. I'm sure that was incredibly difficult for you, yep. But also the easiest decision you've ever made when yes. you're in that legal office and saying, this is just not for me. But it may have meant disappointing a parent, but they're not.
It actually paved the way for my sister. So my sister's 2 years younger than me. And so by the time she had finished VCE, she declared at the end of it, she wanted to be an artist and fashion designer. And they said, okay. You can go to Bendigo. It was Institute of Technology then, and she did fashion design course, and so I guess that really paved the way for both my parents to have an understanding.
What an amazing line of progression in your family, yeah. And how exciting, how thrilling and exciting. Mary, I'll move into so most of your experience is in the primary school sector. And,
it is. Yep.
What are some of the challenges at any point in your career in the face-to-face teaching of primary age children?
So, Jo, I think the biggest challenges were probably very early in my career. And this was at a time, 1980, I set off on my journey into the teaching system. So we had enormous classes, and the first year I came out, I had 33 children, which was considered reasonably small. But I mentioned earlier that I had specialised in classical piano in VCE. So my very first appointment was 0.5 as a classroom teacher in the mornings, and I was the music teacher in the afternoons, every afternoon of the week. So for my classroom in the mornings, I had 33 students, which was reasonably small. But for a couple of the classes in the afternoon that I taught music, particularly the grade 6, there were 45 students in there. And my biggest the first couple of weeks were just chaos because this was considered to be release time for the classroom teacher. So they were such chaos that the principal would come out of the office and find out what all the noise was about in this room because I just didn't have any classroom management skills whatsoever with students that I saw once a week for half an hour. So it ended up that for these very difficult classes that the classroom teacher would sit in with them, it was still very difficult because that music lesson was conducted in the classroom. So I had to be the wandering minstrel almost, and I'd take around all the instruments in boxes, and I had my guitar and so on. So look, it evolved to the point where after I'd been doing this for 3 to 4 years, we then had the school little ensemble. We had a couple of school choirs, and I was able to build up that music culture within the school. But gee, it was hard work, Jo. It was challenges every single day trying to juggle a classroom situation in the mornings, and then I did, as I say, the music specialism in the afternoon. That is now quite illegal. You can't ask new graduate teachers to do specialisms like that anymore because they've realised now that it's so challenging.
Good reason. My
yes.
goodness. And you only said it was one time you remember going home to your mum.
Yeah, it probably was several.
Wow. Yes. Well, clearly you come from a strong family of people who have a very clear work ethic and plenty of emotional support to overcome something so challenging. Again, it just takes me to thinking there's so much that we don't necessarily know about. We enjoy a lot of freedom and
benefits,
and privileges that just didn't exist before.
That's right.
It doesn't mean it's a perfect system now. There's not more work to do, but considering that where we've come from, and it's wow, it's just incredible to think that 33, my goodness.
And 45, that grade 6 teacher had 45.
Interesting because humanities subjects now are perceived quite differently, aren't they, as well? They've had
the arts.
The arts, they've had the turn of being important, not so important. I wonder if there will be a healthy balance there somewhere.
I hope so. It's not going that way at the moment. And Jo, you mentioned before about how you came through in the 90s, about how things were very structured and there was, a certain way that you did things. I do have to say that when I started teaching, it was very much a spontaneous, more of a spontaneous sort of environment, in that we did have, it was not a huge school, but we had me as a music teacher every afternoon of the week. We had a phys ed teacher. I think he was 14.8, so 4 afternoons a week. We also had an art teacher. So we were well resourced back in those days, and there was a lot of spontaneity as far as teaching. So when it was very hot in Wodonga and it could get to into the low 40s at times, we had no air conditioning, we would take the whole school out onto the oval and turn the sprinklers on, and they'd all run around in the sprinklers and get soaking wet. So you couldn't do that nowadays. But
not without a risk assessment.
So there were pros and cons. There was good and there was not so good.
Of course, but it is interesting again, isn't it, that we do find ourselves coming, this is part of the work that I want to do, it's finding that middle ground, because of course times are different, and we live in a different world, but then in a COVID world we do tend to, we're experiencing at present, there is this tendency to look back and see, and do you find that you have conversations with people about one of the many frustrations is things are, yes, there's freedoms, but there's the administration side seems to be peaking, and that's turning people away. It might mean the difference between a teacher deciding to stay or to go, because the investment of your time in things that are not specifically teaching, there's a big pull on that. And I really personally feel, from what I've seen and what I've heard, especially recently on a lot of online forums, it's that it's that sticking point of, I need to do the admin to get here and there and everywhere else, but it's pulling on what we said we came to do, which was to teach.
So it's about having that balance between really spending time with children and really making a difference in their lives, as opposed to ticking off boxes and writing up paperwork. So, but I think, Jo, there's got to be a balance, because I do know that back in the day, we did very scant paperwork. So it was very, very basic.
It's too light.
And it was too light in that we didn't, and I think the thing that we particularly didn't do was we didn't differentiate well. So it was whole class teaching. Everybody learnt the same thing. You had your top and your bottom, and you would cater for that. But a lot of it was not formalised in any sort of paperwork. And that was a mistake, because then when they'd go to the next classroom or whatever, it wasn't followed up very often, or there was no consistency. So there's got to be a balance between paperwork, but paperwork can't take over your life.
You make an excellent point with differentiation. It's I would say that that's something that's changing all the time, but not necessarily any better understood. I think we've still got a long way to go there, those conversations. I was at a meeting this week where we were discussing how much assessment we're doing of children right now, particularly when we haven't seen them. As a preschool teacher about to write transition statements, and other year levels preparing their children for the next grades and the next part of their education. It's a lot for teachers. You were saying that one of those very, apart from the obvious thing of the class sizes and, the teacher coming out to what's going on, but if you were able to, say you saw it yourself, what advice would you give to your younger self if you had been asked for support? What would you have wanted?
I would certainly have been upfront in asking for support straight off the bat. So I struggled along. When I first started the job, I was 20. So I was really, really young, much younger than graduates are now. I didn't ask for help. I struggled along, and I look back now and think that they must have been judging me dreadfully, but nobody stepped in and really, the class teachers would sit in with me. But there was no mentoring program in those days. It was all in silos, and we know that silos don't work well. So I think that was the real issue that confronted us in those days, was working in silos, not reaching out and not assisting and supporting the young new people coming in. So we were left, and most of us in my year that I kept communicating with at the time, we were all left to sink or swim. And I don't think we do that now. I think we give much better support to our young teachers.
Well, as you mentioned at the start of the conversation, that through COVID safe practices from Holmesglen and from students out on placement, at a minimum, there's the support calls for the students. But do you find that working with these young people, observing them, growing with them over the course of their training, some of them coming from certificate and diploma all the way through at Holmesglen Institute, what do you think that those students benefit from most? The ones where you get them to the graduation point, and clearly they're in a different world, but what do you think your best advice would be to those young men and women entering the workforce?
I would say stick with it. So even though there are challenges, even though teaching's tough, teaching's not easy. It's long days, it's weekends, it's a tough gig, but gee, it's rewarding. And nurture your career. Always nurture your career. Sometimes I think, I hear people talk, or they say, you know, I've had this job, but I didn't like it, gave it up, or whatever. And sometimes I think, just stick with it, nurture it. It might be tough now. When I came back from overseas, I did a stint overseas back in the early 2000s. And when I had left Australia, I had been a leading teacher. I'd done my leading teacher certificate at the school. And so I'd left that job, gone overseas for a couple of years for the experience. I came back and I was on the bottom rung of the ladder, and I did relief work for 6 months, and I got some terrible jobs. And there were many days that the phone would ring and I'd think, oh, I don't want to answer it because I know which school it'll be. It'll be the one that they can't get anybody to go out to. But I thought, no, come on, here we go. There's got to be advantages to this. And I always thought, well, the advantage is that I'm getting to see what other people's practices are and how other schools run. I'm getting things to put in my little toolkit all the time. So just going with those really tough times, and they do occur, they will happen, and it might be 6 months, it might only be 2 months or whatever, but seeing them through, getting through, because there's always a light at the end of the tunnel, or gold at the end of the rainbow as far as your career is concerned, if you nurture it.
Oh, that's amazing. And we should mention that you actually, one of your own children is close to graduating as a teacher.
Yes, he's the only one of the three.
Yeah.
Who's taken a path through teaching, and he loves it. He seems to be, as I can say from a mother, a natural born teacher. And sometimes you can really pick those pre-service teachers in your classes and your lectures, the ones who just have that little something, and he does. And yes, he'll be getting his registration in the next month or so. So yeah, I hope some of what I do and say has rubbed off on him.
Seems that it has. It seems that it has. Mary, thank you so much for your time today. There is so many more places we could go. I think we're going to have another call at some point.
Yes.
But really appreciate your insight, your wisdom, and everything that you're doing towards creating our teachers of the future, and having had a big hand in the careers of many teachers who are now enjoying and nurturing those careers out in the workplace.
Thank you, Jo. Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.